down on prey, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I am your host, Josh Howard, and I'm joined today with an interview that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. Dr. Greg Beale is joining us today. So, Dr. Beale, great to have you on here finally, sir.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So, Dr. Beale, you have written and spoken a lot over the years, and it's always a challenge when looking at something like this to think of, if I had Greg Beale for a minute, what would we talk about with eschatology? But before we get into some of those topics, I want to make sure to cover the book projects that you have going on. You have a website where people can, I know, keep up with you at GK. It's gkbeale.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah, they should be able to keep up with my publications there. Yeah.
Fantastic. So you had Union with the Resurrected Christ, and I want to talk a little bit about the approach to this and some of your other works, but Union with the Resurrected Christ, which is new in my count, but you've had one that's publishing since then. I'm not sure if it's hit the shelves yet, the dictionary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Is that one
That's
still
right.
in
It's
publication?
dictionary on New Testament use of the Old.
Perfect. Do you have
Yeah.
a copy there? Did I see you grabbing?
There's the cover.
All right, perfect.
It's a dictionary of the New Testament use of the Old, and I don't know, it's almost 950 pages, and we have a lot of contributors. This is supposed to go hand in hand with our the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old that Don Carson and I edited and published in 2007.
Right.
And so this is not a revision of that commentary. We are going to do a revision of that commentary. It's going to come out in 2027 or 28, however.
Okay.
And that revision will be focusing on updating the bibliographies, but also being able to expand the substance of the essays themselves, because we're asking authors to add, pay more attention to allusions and not just quotations. Now, some of the authors did that, but some didn't, and even those that did, they're probably more. So we're going to focus also on integrating allusions, and so that'll be a revision, and the Book of Acts will be written by someone completely new, as will the Gospel of John. So those will not just be revised, but those will be rewritten. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, so we had, for those watching, if you have not seen the video, the most recent one we did with Ben Glad, I think Dr. Glad's been on here twice, but this last time that he came on, he was talking a little bit about how those two books pair together. So if anybody hasn't seen that, I would recommend checking that out as well. He's talking via book.
Yeah, and I'm an editor of the dictionary, as is Carson, and then Ben Glad and Andy Naselli. So now the editors of the revision of the commentary on New Testament use of the Old will be Carson, me, and just Glad. So, so the dictionary, what it does is it's different from the commentary. The dictionary, in the commentary, you'll read an author talking about typology. So in the dictionary, you can look up typology. There'll be an article on it, or maybe in the commentary, an author will talk about allegory. Well, you can look up what is allegory. A lot of times, authors will mention the Septuagint or the LXX, and you can look up and find good articles on the Septuagint, the various versions of the Septuagint, and how much of the Septuagint percentage-wise roughly is used in the New Testament, and so on. Articles like, can we reproduce the interpretive method of the New Testament writers? Do the New Testament article, for example, do the New Testament writers use the Old Testament in line with the original meaning of the Old Testament? It's a very important issue.
Absolutely.
even among that's even debated among some evangelicals, and then an essay on the definition of illusion, quotation illusion, and echo, and how do you validate a true echo and a true illusion. So it's those, that's a sampling of the articles on the temple, articles on a method of interpreting the old and the new, and so on.
Very
Yeah.
good. No, I appreciate that overview of that. And it kind of branches in well. One thing that I wanted to make sure to ask you about and just kind of have you share has to do with how you approach those sort of topics. So if you're really, what I'm going to ask you is, and I'm going to kind of try to lead you into what I mean by this question, is if you can just give people a little bit of a sense for how you approach, what your hermeneutical approach is, what your exegetical approach is, how you're kind of aiming at these topics. And I'm thinking specifically with eschatology, because I suspect most people, especially on our channel, that are going to tune in here, will know your works from eschatology. You've written a lot on it. You wrote the hilariously titled shorter commentary on Revelation, which is, still quite dense, still quite a lot there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to tell you the story behind that.
Yeah, no, I'd appreciate that. But with a lot of your work though, you're integrating biblical theology in. And I've always really appreciated that. Maybe if you could just give us a little direction with that. But now I'm curious about the story behind the title. So
I'll do the story first and then my approach to eschatology. Okay. I published my commentary on Revelation, which is here's the cover for that one.
Yep.
That was published in 1999, and for years, 15 years, maybe more, people were asking me, can't you do a shorter commentary? Take out the Greek. Don't have so much material. Make the arguments shorter and simpler and so on. So finally, in about, I don't know, 2014, 2013, I started thinking about it. And the way I started thinking about it is a pastor sent me an email and he said, hey, I've summarized your 1,300 page Revelation commentary in 137 pages. And I didn't even look at it. I thought, I'm sorry. That can't be done. I didn't even look at it. I read his email, but I didn't look at his 137 page summary. But a year later, I thought, I've got a few minutes. I'll see if I can find that email in my email records. And I did, and I looked at it, and it was too short. I mean, you can't summarize, in my opinion, it's hard to summarize my commentary in 137 pages, but he did have a good grasp of what I was saying, number one. And number two, he was a good writer. So I contacted him because I didn't have time to do this. It's just a matter of reorganizing and summarizing my material, just manual labor.
Mm.
So I said, would you be interested? I'm not interested in your 137 page thing, but would you be interested in helping me shorten this commentary? And so what I did, he said yes. And so what I did is I took a couple of chapters from the commentary and shortened it in the way I thought, and added, as I recollect, vaguely how you would ask some practical application questions, which is a new feature of the shorter commentary in contrast to the big commentary. Anyway, I did some model chapters the way I thought they should be done. I said, okay, you follow my model, take a new chapter. He did. It worked. Publisher said, let's go with it. So we did. And then there was a debate within among the editors at Erdman's Publishers. My editor and I wanted to call this let me see, I thought I had this here. Yeah, Revelation, a shorter commentary. And the editor said, no, you can't call this a shorter commentary because most of the standard commentaries on the book of Revelation are not as long as this supposedly shorter commentary. And so, we said, look, shorter has to do with regard to the bigger commentary. And the bigger commentary now, probably after almost 20 years, is well enough known that it's the longer commentary. So most people, when they say shorter, they're going to understand what that means.
Right.
Not shorter in a true sense, but compared to the other one. So we went out, and it's called Revelation, a shorter commentary. And I'm very happy I did that. I wouldn't have done it if this guy hadn't helped me with the manual labor, because wow, it was just a lot of work, and I'm just always working on something. So he motivated me to do it. So he would do a chapter, then I would look at it, I would revise it, and then we'd go with it. So I'm really glad I did, because it's done well. It seems to be there's a real need for it. So very
Absolutely.
happy.
So it's shorter in the same way that the Westminster Shorter Catechism is shorter than something. It's just not exactly short in and of itself.
Right.
Right. Okay, that's awesome. So tell me a little bit about your approach to that,
Yeah,
though.
my approach is this, that a lot of people view eschatology as a futurology, usually in evangelical circles, at least in the United States, but elsewhere, I think. People will talk about eschatology in terms of contemporary world events. Israel's come back into their land, and now the king of the north from Ezekiel 38 and 39 looks to be Russia, and the king of the south seems to be Egypt, and the king of the west is some sort of revived economic political entity in Western Europe. And so king of the east maybe is China. I mean, that's one of the scenarios. It's been a long established scenario for how things are now forming, that it looks like the end times are just about here. That's what I mean, that the end times usually are viewed as something future, the coming of Christ in the future, the rapture in the future, the tribulation in the future. And I began to study. I said, I'm going to go to the Bible and see how often does the phrase latter days, end times, consummation of the ages, last hour, etc., synonyms, how much are they used, and how are they used? So I start with the Old Testament. And it's actually Gerhardus Voss that inspired me to do this, because he did a very brief study of that in his Pauline Eschatology in one of the chapters. So I said, I'm going to really look into that. I like what he's done here. And so I began to look at the phrases in the Old Testament. They occur all over the Old Testament. And intriguingly, in the Old Testament, they are future. They're all future. And it may be about the coming of the Messiah. It may be about a coming tribulation. It may be about Israel's coming restoration. It may be about coming of the new creation. It may be about the coming of the resurrection, and so on. And so I looked at all it, but they're all future. So I said, okay, now I'm going to go to the New Testament. And those phrases occur again all over the place. And intriguingly, 90 to 95% of them are not exclusively future, as in the Old Testament. They are what I call already and not yet, very famous phrase among biblical theologians. In other words, the prophecies of the Old Testament, end time prophecies, have begun, but they're not consummated. From the Old Testament perspective, it looks like they're going to happen in one fell swoop. But in reality, what happens is you get an inauguration and the continuation of that, and then a final consummation, something that wasn't, I don't think, clearly foreseen in the Old Testament, though the seeds were there. And so I began to see, okay, eschatology is not just futurology for the New Testament writers as it was for the Old. For example, Acts 2:17, in these last days, God has spoken through us. God has poured forth his spirit. Or Hebrews 1, 1 and 2. In these last days, God has spoken to his son. Or in 1 Corinthians 10, the consummation of the ages has come upon you, the Corinthians. Or 1 John 2:17, my little children, it's the last hour. You've heard that Antichrist is coming. I tell you, many Antichrists have already come. From this, we know it is the last hour. And then it goes on to talk about those many Antichrists as the Antichristos, the Antichrist. And so there's a sense in which the Great Tribulation's begun, because that's when it was to begin, when the Antichrist came. That's begun. And that blew my mind right there. The Great Tribulation's begun in the first century. Wow. And so I then wrote an essay and then expanded it into a book called The New Testament Biblical Theology, where and I further followed that up with another book that was a sequel to that called Union with the Resurrected Christ. The general thesis is this, that eschatology is soteriology, for example. Eschatology is sanctification. Eschatology is regeneration. So I argue in the book and in Union with Christ, the resurrected Christ, every major doctrine in the New Testament is an eschatological doctrine. You have to understand eschatology to understand it in its full richness. So we should not be put off and misled by systematic theologies that put eschatology at the end of the book as one doctrine among many. No, should be at the beginning of the book, even the systematic theology. Of course, that would make it a little bit of a biblical theology, but nevertheless, all of these doctrines that are going to be seen should be seen through the lens of eschatology. That apostolic writers, the New Testament writers, breathe the air of eschatology, and whatever they wrote was colored by it. So, yeah, and I think if one understands even Genesis 1 to 3, that soteriology does not precede eschatology, but eschatology precedes soteriology in the sense that you got Adam in the garden, and if he had obeyed, I believe he would have received the full blessings that the last Adam received. Of course, that wasn't God's plan, but they would have been eschatological blessings. He would have received an immortal body and an immortal spirit. The devil would have been decisively done away with, no threat from evil. The environment of the world would have been permanent. Everything would have been permanent. There would have been a glorification of everything. That's eschatology, even before you consider soteriology. But as a result of Paul's fall, you then get soteriology. You then get the doctrines of salvation. Humanity needs to be saved. But there wouldn't have been any soteriology if Adam had been obedient, very intriguingly.
Yeah. No,
so once you understand Genesis 1 to 3, everything after that's moving back toward what the last Adam will do. Everything.
I really appreciate that.
The first Adam did. So everything's to be, again, in that light, is to be seen eschatologically. So that's my approach. You want to probe me with some questions about it?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful, and I love the way, because kind of like you said, my training was in systematic theology, but I love the biblical theology that you're bringing into that whole Bible story, as opposed to it just being some sort of disconnected bookend on the end, which is, I think, what we fight against a lot of times, even in our own thinking, is seeing eschatology all throughout Scripture. I guess one of the questions that I had come up, it's not exactly to do with your method, but just thinking of all of the work you've put in this field, because again, it's not like you just write about eschatology, but you're very much involved in it. You're aware of the conversations. I wonder what your take is on the current state of things within, I don't know if I want to say evangelical eschatology, but as far as eschatology goes within our circles, what are the current issues that you see popping up? What's the progress do you think we've made? Every time obviously there was a conflict in the Middle East just recently, and every time something like that happens, there's inevitably some, eschatological conversations on social media and that sort of things. We're in an election year again; these conversations always come up. But just kind of looking past the surface level stuff, where do you see maybe work to be done in the field of eschatology? Maybe progress that we've made in the field of eschatology since you've been working in this field for decades. What's your take on the lay of the land?
Well, again, it's limited. It's only what I'm exposed to from what I read from churches, the church I attend, from churches that I go to when I speak at conferences and other academic conferences, et cetera. So my view is going to be limited. But one thing you have to understand, okay, I'm giving you an overview from the early 1970s up until now. Okay.
Awesome.
Is that too early?
No, that's great.
So obviously, as I think about it, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, and of course, there I learned classic dispensationalism. That being that the church and Israel were completely separate, that there would be a rapture followed by a 7-year tribulation, followed by a millennium where Christ reigns, followed by a final attack of Satan against Christ, followed by his defeat, followed by the destruction of the old heavens and earth and the new heavens and earth. That was the scenario. But in the midst of all of that is the key core element of dispensationalism. Christ and the church and Israel are separate. Okay. So then come the 80s and the late 80s, and you get someone like Darrell Bock and Craig Blazing at the Evangelical Theological Society establishing sections where papers are read on what they start calling progressive dispensationalism. Now, what that means is a little hard to say. It's sort of like when people talk about constructive theology. What's the word I'm trying to think of here? Yeah, maybe I'll think of it later. But it's a little hard because basically what one can say that's common to all progressive dispensationalists is they still see Israel and the church as separate. That's why they are progressive dispensationalists, okay? But the progressive element is that they see the latter days, most of them, as beginning. And so in some way. Now, on the spectrum of progressive dispensationalists, some are closer to a classic view. Some get very close to the church being Israel view, very close. Even use that language sometimes. But then at the end say, no, I still see Israel and the church as separate. And then there's some sort of in the middle. So, that's sort of the lay of the land there, because classic dispensationalism said the latter days only began, at the time of the rapture and forward. Whereas now they're saying the coming of Christ, the first coming, introduced the latter days. Now, so what does that mean? That means it would appear that the church age is not a mystery age, as the classic view held. And so, how does the church fit in here? Because the church is seen but Paul, Jesus, will take prophecies of the restoration of Israel and apply it to the church as fulfilled. Well, that sounds like the church is fulfilling the promises of Israel. No. Someone like Darrell Bock would say the church is inheriting the promises of Israel, but not fulfilling the promises of Israel. What is the difference? Now, for myself, I don't see a difference, but he does. And I'm just going to lay it out this way, because, I could go into a lot of things that have changed over the years in eschatology, but since this is so prevalent, I think it's good to start with dispensationalism and progressive. So one progressive dispensationalist gave me this illustration. He said of how the church can inherit the promises of Israel but not fulfill it. He said, let's say next door the Smiths live next door to you, and they have a little boy named Johnny, and you live next door to them, and when you mow the lawn, you see Johnny, and he has a football, and yeah, every once in a while you play catch with him, and you get to know Johnny and you really like Johnny. Well, tragically, his parents die in a car accident, and one thing leads to another, and you decide to ask Johnny to come live with you, and you'll raise Johnny kind of in a foster way, but he stays with you, and but he retains his name. His name is Johnny Smith, even though he grows up in the Beale household. And but when you come to sort out your will, your three biological children, you're going to add Johnny, and so Johnny inherits your will because that's what you wanted him to. That's what you wanted. Your other children inherit the other parts of your inheritance because they're biological children and they're legal children. Johnny was neither. So in a certain sense, they fulfill the will he inherits. So they make that distinction. So I like to change the illustration, and so let me just clarify what I just said. So Israel are the legal, biological, if you will, and fulfillers. The church is an inheritor. They don't fulfill. They're not Israel. Just as Johnny Smith is not a Beale. Okay.
Gotcha.
He inherits, but he's not a Beale, biologically or legally. But nevertheless, he inherits. He can do that as a Smith. So the church can inherit the same thing Israel does, but they're not Israel. Okay. So the church and Israel are still separate. So that's a fine line. You can see how the progressive dispensationalists are cutting it very, very fine. Now, I like that illustration, by the way. I just changed it a little bit. I say the Smiths die. I, as the Beale father, I'm at my family, my wife and I, we don't have Johnny Smith come live with us and keep his name. We adopt him. He's Johnny Smith Beale. So that when he inherits as a Beale. And just like my other children, even though he's not biological, he still inherits as a true Beale. And so the church, when they come into union with Christ, he is their legal representative. And they inherit because Jesus is true Israel. They're true Israel. He's the Son of God. They're the Son of God. They take on his name. And so that's why I think the church and Israel are the same. Now, so that's just one huge area that's developed. And it's kind of now become concretized. I mean, it's settled in. I don't think anything more is developing radically there. There has been off and on, ever since the 70s on up to the present, another debate called preterism. Preterism argues, consistent preterism, classic, that in 70 AD, the second coming of Christ occurred. And that the final judgment occurred, the new creation occurred. It all was spiritual, though. Christ came spiritually. There was a spiritual resurrection, not physical, but spiritual. And so they would say that, the book of Revelation is written pre-70 AD, and therefore it's about the fulfillment of the prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, Jerusalem being Babylon the Great. And it prophesies, how Babylon the Great will be destroyed in the book of Revelation. And so, that's a very interesting view. And then there are partial preterists. Now, partial preterists still see a second final coming of Christ, but in the book of Revelation, they don't. They see it actually as prophesying the fall of Jerusalem, but they'll acknowledge in Paul or in the Gospels occasionally there are references to a true second coming of Christ and final judgment and new heavens and a new earth. So for consistent preterism, however, you've got to take the book of Revelation very figuratively and other portions of Scripture. So, the new heavens and earth is not a physical new heavens and earth. It's spiritual. The resurrection is not physical, it's spiritual, and on and on. Now, one of the problems with classic preterism is that since they don't believe in a physical resurrection, they fall not just into a false teaching category, but, and I don't like to say this, but I think it's a heretical category. The reason I make a difference between false teaching and heresy, false teaching doesn't lead to a final judgment of someone. They could still be saved if they're a false teacher or follow it. But heresy leads to final judgment. And so why would preterism lead to final judgment? Because the curses on Adam were not just spiritual, they were also physical. And if the curses are not removed, then we're still under a curse. But we've got to be removed from under the physical curses of Adam with the full resurrection. This is why Paul says we're still in our sins in 1 Corinthians 15. If there's no resurrection of the dead, okay? And he has other arguments for why that's a heresy. It also means that Christ hasn't died, but I'm just going to stick with the other one, that I think one of the reasons that it's a heresy is because the full curses of Adam will not have been removed. So that's another aspect. This is all within evangelicalism. And then you do, especially in the southern part of the United States, it seems, as well as in Moscow, up in the northern Midwest, there is a revived interest in postmillennialism, and especially as an attempt to reform culture. That Christianity should reform culture, and people like the name Wilson and others have been mentioned in this discussion. So that's another area. Now in the 70s, there was an interest in postmillennialism, especially again in the South. And it was put together with a Reconstructionist movement to reconstruct culture. It was called theonomic postmillennialism, where the whole Old Testament law carries over into the New, and that we're to reform the government and the economy, et cetera. So that's had a little bit of a revival again. Not so much the theonomic part of it, but the cultural transformation part of it. So those are some reflections. I don't know if you want to press a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I'm curious about this, and I do want to be. I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock because I know you said you had about 45. So feel free to cut me off here. But I'm thinking toward just that. Well, just to throw it out there. So we talked to Keith Matheson. This has been a while now, but we were talking to Dr. Matheson, and he was talking about. Essentially, he suggested what it might look like for the church to experience I think he termed it a Nicaea moment, as far as eschatology goes. And we've kind of kicked that idea around a little bit and just talked about what might that look like, and is it even possible? Are we coming to a place in which some of these eschatological threads are starting to get a little closer? Or are issues becoming clearer? Are we seeing some kind of convergence there? And if so, I wonder what would that look like? So you mentioned a couple of threads, specifically with full preterism. We've engaged some of those themes before. And you look at a lot of these kind of divergences, but it does make you look toward the center and say, are we gaining sort of traction together versus where we've been? You mentioned the 70s on. Are we gaining a little bit of traction? And if so, what would that look like? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but just trying to think.
Well, only, obviously, partial preterism. I think it's a viable view. I don't agree with it. It's a possible view. As I say, I don't agree with it. And in my commentary, the big one throughout, I have footnotes dealing with it. in various passages where they make points about it. Like at the end of chapter 11, the time came for the dead to be judged. Well, they think that's 70 AD. And wow, it's amazing that the dead were eschatologically judged at 70 AD. A partial preterists would somehow try to fit that into their view. So partial preterists, I mean, yeah, I think they would buy into inaugurated eschatology and the church is true Israel. And they're certainly not heretical. I just disagree with their perspective on Revelation. And then the dispensationalists on the academic level are coming closer, as I described, those who are in the middle of that spectrum and towards the end that's getting close to the church being Israel spectrum. That's in my opinion, that's a good move in classic dispensationalism. It does not seem to have affected popular dispensationalism. So that whenever, as you mentioned a while ago, you get mention of these events, there's a Hamas attacking Israel, or something happens in the Middle East, then people say, oh, the red heifer, a red heifer has been shipped to Israel, and they're getting ready for the temple to be rebuilt, and so forth and so on.
Right.
That was something discussed in churches, the red heifer. And so that's just kind of popular dispensationalism and the rebuilding of the temple. I address, is the temple going to be rebuilt, in my book, The Temple and the Church's Mission. And I don't think there's going to be an architectural temple, because Christ is the temple and the church is the temple. And I think that's just, and I think that Christ is the beginning of the land inheritance as he rises from the dead. That sounds strange, perhaps, but I do talk about in a recent essay I've written for Gospel Coalition, because of the Hamas invasion and these discussions, they wanted me to write something about how are the land promises of Israel going to be fulfilled? Are they being fulfilled now? So I wrote something, Darrell Block wrote something, and I believe Gerald McDermott wrote something. Both McDermott and Bach believe that they will inherit the nation itself will inherit the land promises, and there will be a nation of Israel for eternity, separate from the church. I disagree with that, as you might see from the essay. But there is a coming closer together, I think, among those view. Postmillennialists also have an already and not yet view. So there is, in terms of already and not yet, I do think that there's been a positive movement in all these different sectors.
That's encouraging to hear. Number one, I'm super sympathetic to what you mentioned about the popular level. It's always interesting to track that a little bit. What are some of the areas maybe where there's a lot of work to be done? Where are you seeing some of those? Because you've mentioned a few specific things. You mentioned, for example, progressive dispensationalism, some of the developments. If you're, if there's a guy watching this and, he's a young scholar, young academic, young pastor, and you're looking to where are some areas that we could really use some refining and really use some back and forth, some sharpening, any insights on any of that?
Yes. I think one should begin to experiment in the area of marginal theology. Now, what in the world do I mean by marginal theology? I say it a little bit tongue in cheek. What I mean by it is that I think that, especially if younger scholars are interested in this, then they need to pay attention to the margins of the Nestle-Aland text. All right. Now, why would they need to do that? Well, instead of saying, oh, I think we need to, instead of attacking this topically, saying, well, with progressive dispensationalism, I need to work in this area, or with partial preterism, I'm going to try to work in this area. I don't think it should be attacked topically like that. What I would do is go to places which are very important texts for preterism or for postmillennialism or for progressive dispensationalism. And you would have to read their writings very carefully for this. And then I would go to the Greek text and I would start looking at the margins, because the margins of the Nestle-Aland Greek text designate not just quotations, which are easy to see, but allusions. And it's in the area of allusion where biblical theology can be investigated much, much more than it has. It's in the area of allusion. And so check the allusions in those important passages and see if anyone has made anything of those allusions. If they hadn't, what do they mean in the Old Testament? What do they mean now? Can this refine what a preterist has said or correct it? Or can this refine what the dispensationalist has said or correct it? Can this refine what an amillennialist has said or correct it, etc.? So do the same thing in Revelation 20, though that's been worked over a little bit more.
Right.
So I would say if anything's going to be added to this discussion, I think it's going to be from what I call the exegetical perspective or the interpretive perspective. Find out those important texts. And that's going to be a task in and of itself to really find the key ones and to do it, as exhaustively as possible. And then go and check and see, are there allusions here that haven't been looked at? That to me is probably the most important.
No, that's good. Yeah, marginal theology. You threw me off when you said that, because I was like, have I missed something there? No, that makes sense though, and it helps to anchor you, as you've spoken of before that I've heard. It helps to guard you against the kind of proof texting, the dicta probantia that we're so easily slipping into. Instead, grappling with that whole of Scripture and anchoring yourself in there. I think it's helpful. Dr. Beale, I do want to be respectful of your time, but we've already mentioned your website, gkbeale.com. Are you still available for people to take classes with you? What's that look like for you right now?
Yeah, I'm teaching full time at Reformed Theological Seminary, and so when we've just had we're a very small seminary as a branch of RTS down here in Dallas, but we doubled our enrollment this past fall.
Congratulations.
Which means we had 22 students coming in.
Excellent.
But one reason I came down here 3 years ago is because I wanted small classes, have a face-to-face teaching experience with small classes. So we go out to meals after class, that sort of thing. And yeah, my own emphasis is marginal theology and old and the new. Also, what I call discourse analysis, something that Tom Schreiner teaches over at Southern, and John Piper teaches, or he used to. I'm not sure he still teaches that. He may, and so what that is a way of finding the logical flow of thought in a passage and the main point. And that's sort of what keeps me going, because that's crucial for a pastor to find the main point in the passage.
No kidding.
You talk to a lot of people, if you ask them, how do you find the main point? They might say, well, if there's a word that's repeated, that's the main point in a passage. Or if it looks like there's a theme that's repeated, that's the main point. Or if the passage begins and ends in the same way, well, that's the main point. Or if there's a chiasm in the middle is a main point. And all that's helpful. But it's really not as important as this approach of how to follow the logical steps of the author's thinking until it reaches the main point. So that's something that we do. It's not an easy procedure, but it's one that if students can digest it, I think it'll change their pastoral life and preaching.
I was about to say, immensely applicable, seems like. That's excellent. Well, Dr. Beale, thank you so much for joining me. I do appreciate your time, and just want to recommend again, dictionary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Do you still have the copy there on the desk?
Yeah, I do. And then also I have we were going to talk about union with the resurrected Christ.
That's right. Time ran out on us, but yeah, both of those immensely helpful and much appreciated. But yeah, Dr. Beale, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your work in this field. Truly appreciated.
All right. Very good.
at my right hand, the